uma apresentação do professor Bylund, que é membro do Mises Institute, professor assistente de Empreendedorismo e Registros, professor Johnston de Free Enterprise na Escola de Empreendedorismo da Spear School of Business da Oklahoma State University e membro associado do Ratio Institute em Estocolmo. Ele já ocupou cargos na Baylor University e na University of Missouri e, além disso, o Dr. Bylund publicou pesquisas nos principais periódicos de empreendedorismo e administração, bem como no Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics e na Review of Austrian Economics. Ele é autor de 2 livros completos, O Visto, o Invisível e o Não Realizado, Como os Regulamentos Afetam a Vida Cotidiana, e O Problema da Produção, uma Nova Teoria da Empresa. Ele, além do mais, edita a série de livros de economia austríaca na agenda Publishing e edita o volume A Próxima Geração de Economia Austríaca, ensaios em honra a Joseph T. Salerno, publicado pelo Instituto Mises. Ele fundou 4 startups de negócios e escreve uma coluna mensal para a revista Entrepreneur. Salva de palmas aqui para o professor.
All right, thank you very much to Ulysses, and thank you to my previous comrade, Dan Sraldi. This talk is going to be a little different. I'm going to address something of more theoretical nature than a personal journey. Also, if you're here to see me undress, that's not going to happen. Only Dan Sraldi will undress when he actually gives a talk. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about where entrepreneurship fits in economics and in economic theory. And if you were here a bit ago, you will have seen that I introduced a special issue of the Mises Journal on entrepreneurship, and during that presentation I said that economics does not talk about entrepreneurship at all, which is true, but the question of course is, where does it fit? Where does Austrian economics, well, where does entrepreneurship fit in economic theory? So if you go back very quickly, I'm going to just summarize where standard economics is so that we're on the same page, and then I'm going to move on and talk about how I conceive of economics in a different way than most economics professors. So standard economics, it usually begins with this static state analysis where there is no change, all the changes have already happened, or you will add a change to the economy. In a sense, economics always starts with the economist's gang sign, right? Supply and demand, right? So when economists meet each other at night, they go like that, and you know that you're in the club. And if you're not actually sure whether the other guy is an economist, you go more like this, just to make sure that you are on the same level. Right, but it's a static state type of analysis, and there are no economic profits because everything is already evened out. Everything already works perfectly, and it's optimized, and there's no waste, and everything is just perfect, except that nothing is really going on. This is an economy where nothing actually happens. So why do we study this? It's not actually very clear, and when you listen to the previous talk, and all talks, basically in this room and during this conference, the economy is all about movement and change and dynamics. So why is it that we talk about the economy in these types of terms where we even define perfect competition as the lack of competition? If you think about it, perfect competition, I think it was Hayek who said, perfect competition has nothing to do with competition. In a perfectly competitive economy, there is no competition. No one is trying to beat any other seller. So why do we refer to that as competition? There's something very wrong here, right? Okay, so I'm not the first to identify this or observe this lack in modern economics. This is Joseph Schumpeter, who was half Austrian, if you want to be generous. And he recognized already in the 1940s that there's something missing in economic theory, the way it is taught and the way it is understood and the way it is analyzed. And he even went as far as saying that economics without entrepreneurship, that's like Hamlet without the Danish prince. The main character is no longer in the story. What kind of story is that? That's like Daniel Suralda's story without Daniel Suralda. That doesn't make any sense. Nothing is going on. And still, economics is without entrepreneurship. So what does that even mean? This, of course, is economics. Gang sign and a static state. Well, I usually draw this on the board to my students. And my students are in entrepreneurship, but they've all been forced to suffer an economics class or two. And I ask them, where is entrepreneurship in this? Because we all know that entrepreneurship is important. And we all know that there are entrepreneurs in the economy. And whenever we turn on the television, we hear politicians saying that we need more entrepreneurship. Okay, well, take this gang sign. Where do you fit the entrepreneur? Where is entrepreneurship in this? It's a valid question, right? Is it what happens before we start studying this gang sign? Is it what leads us to this static state that equilibrates the economy? Or is it what happens afterwards? Is it what disequilibrates the economy? Is it what disrupts the economy, that changes things up after it has already had this perfectly even type of optimized situation, the static state? So which one is it? Or is it maybe both? Where do we put the entrepreneur? Well, let's look at it. So what I'm going to do is go through first, what is entrepreneurship that leads to this static state? And what would entrepreneurship be that comes after the static state, that disrupts this? Can we think of entrepreneurship as both, or should it be one and not the other? So in the first case, entrepreneurship that leads to general equilibrium. What does that look like? Well, we can think of it in the same terms as Israel Kirzner talked about the entrepreneur, as some kind of imitative entrepreneurship where you correct errors. You see that there are prices that aren't exactly the same, so you can buy at low prices over here, you can sell at higher prices over there, and you make an arbitrage gain. So, well, what's going to happen? Well, you increase demand over here with the lower prices, so the price is going up a little bit, and you're increasing supply over here where you're selling, so the price is going to fall a little bit, so you even things out. It's going to take us closer to the static state, to the gang sign, right? This, of course, means that there's more competition. There are more businesses, more entrepreneurs doing similar things, trying to figure out how to get a little piece of the pie. This is also how innovations that have already happened start to disseminate and diffuse in the economy. So the innovations spread. So a typical example of this would be an economy where you have already seen a huge innovation that consumers consider to be very valuable, but only one business has it so far. Well, what are the other businesses going to do? Well, they're going to copy. They're going to imitate. They're going to try to get part of that profit. Well, if they all do that and do it equally well, no one is going to earn any profit anymore. But the consumer is going to get a whole lot of benefit out of this, right? So this is about the adjustment of the economy to find out how the economy overall can satisfy consumers in the best way possible. It's about all entrepreneurs seeing these opportunities and exploiting these errors, if you will, or this uneven surface. Okay, and Kirzner addresses this in exactly those terms, as you can see here, error solving or arbitrage. Okay? Well, what Kirzner was trying to do here was really to save the gang sign analysis, the static state type of analysis using supply and demand schedules and so forth. What he was doing is trying to show that there is a process that leads to this steady state. So you start out with an economy that is in disequilibrium, where there are all these errors, there's all this money lying around on the table, but no one has seen this money yet. But as soon as someone sees it, they're going to grab it, and then the money is gone. The economy is closer to satisfying people as much as possible, right? So it's really about the problem solving that goes on. And what Kirzner was trying to show, and what he did show, I think, is that the economy is always getting closer and closer. Because if all these entrepreneurs are trying to solve these problems that still remain, if entrepreneurs are solving these errors, correcting these errors, we're going to get closer and closer to this, the gang sign, which means that we're going to be, at this point, close enough to be able to use the same models that we actually use in economics. So when we shift the curves back and forth and we look at surpluses and things like that, we're not quite there, but we're close enough so we can still use the models. So in a sense, Kerzner was proving that economics is not as worthless as it might seem, just when I started out saying that it's not a static state. It's dynamic and it's moving around. Well, it's not so far from equilibrium either that we have to do away with economics completely. Rather, we can rely on economics models. We can use economic analysis to understand the economy because of entrepreneurship that takes us so close that those models are close enough. So it's sort of scientific. Okay, what this means, though, is that what we're talking about here is really a within-system type of action. So one way of thinking of this is that, well, the economy overall has boundaries, and there are no real disruptions happening, but everything is unevenly distributed. Innovations have not diffused completely. People are doing things in different ways. They're buying at different prices and so forth. All these adjustments and changes that are happening in this economy are within this system. They're not really challenging the boundaries of the system overall. They're just changing how it works within the system. So there's, of course, progress. Don't get me wrong. But the boundaries are sort of static. There's nothing revolutionary happening due to Kerznerian entrepreneurship. So we're getting closer and closer to this equilibrium, which is moving a little bit all the time because people are changing their minds. But it's not like we're going to be disrupted completely, and it's going to be a completely new economy, and we're very far away from it. We're getting closer and closer. So this means that we're getting a better resource allocation, we're increasing our productivity, and it's sort of a smooth process, step by step, getting better and better, but not taking any huge leaps forward. Okay? Now, what remains from where we are to this equilibrium state, to the gang sign, is really these three variables that are changing all the time, that entrepreneurs are trying to catch up with. And those are the changing consumer preferences. We want other things, different days, we want different things, and we see someone who has something that we didn't even know existed before, but now we want that as well because we can see how, that's pretty nice, I want that too. So I change my preferences, and of course some of my wants I've already satisfied, so I will move on to something else when I have more income. So those changes are always going to have the target, the equilibrium, to be a moving target. We will never actually reach it, as Kerzner also says. We will also have production adjustments when people change their wants, people change their market activities, they start buying different things. The economy is going to adjust to that. The production apparatus overall is going to change the direction somewhat. They're going to adapt their production to where people actually are consuming their things, or where they believe that they will be consuming. But still, it's in a system that doesn't really change all that much. The boundaries might be increasing a little bit slowly, sort of with population growth, perhaps, if you want to go with Adam Smith. But nothing big is going on. It can still appear big to you as an individual within this system. So don't get me wrong, this is not a boring system at all. But the system itself is sort of slow moving, okay? But the point is that all this entrepreneurship is leading to equilibration. Okay, what about the second case? What does entrepreneurship mean if we start with a steady state, with a gang sign analysis, and then we add entrepreneurship to it? Is that a reasonable assumption? Well, it's a different type of entrepreneurship to begin with, right? That in this case, we're talking about very innovative entrepreneurship that completely pulls the rug from under the feet of everybody and changes things up quite a bit. So you can think of the economy as a big jar with sand in it or something. You start shaking it like this. And you change completely how how things are working out and who has resources and what resources are valuable and things like that. And some examples of these are the unicorn type of businesses recently that change everything. Peter Thiel has the book 0 to 1. The point is to create a business where there is none before. Create a new service or a product where there is none before, so that you become a monopolist because you offer something that is completely new. So think the world before Facebook and after Facebook, things like that. Something huge that changes how everybody is acting. Well, this is by definition disequilibrating. This doesn't take us closer to the gang sign. This takes us out of the gang sign. That's where we started out. And it necessarily moves it quite a bit away from us. So rather than being an equilibrating process, this is disequilibrating. Right? We're going from the static state to a different situation where everything is a little bit in a mess. Okay? Well, there are theorists who have talked about this too. Schumpeter, like I mentioned before, he talked about it as creative destruction, where you create something new that completely changes people's behavior, and therefore the way it was done before is destroyed. He did not mean go out and bomb stuff. What he meant was simply that the smartphone destroyed the flip phone. Not because someone actually destroyed the flip phones or the flip phone makers, but people did not want flip phones anymore. As soon as they saw smartphones, they didn't want flip phones anymore. There's still value in flip phones, but not as much, because there was something much better. So a flip phone manufacturer like Samsung started to do something completely different. They started to copy Apple's iPhone and produce smartphones themselves instead of continuing to produce flip phones. And Clayton Christensen talks about this in terms of disruption of the economy, how this completely changes the framework for how things are set up and for the economy overall, production and so forth. Okay, so what does this mean then? Well, there should be a picture of my book right there. Was this censored? Okay, so what this means is that we're not actually talking about adjustments within the system anymore. What we're talking about is moving the boundaries of the system, right? So we're talking about a different system because we're expanding the system itself, not because we're tweaking and adjusting things inside the system and evening things out and solving problems. We're doing something completely different. We're moving the boundaries out, changing it. And I put it in terms of increasing the extent of the market. Schumpeter, like I mentioned, is talking about creative destruction, creating something de novo, something completely new that no one even thought about before, and something that people didn't even think might be valuable. But someone figured it out, and they invested in making it happen, and they were right, or at least close enough, right? In this view of entrepreneurship, the entrepreneur is an innovator, is a kind of leader, someone who goes his own way, maybe idiosyncratic, a little weird, but still figures out what people actually want. Not just imitating, as we talked about before, but instead figuring out completely new ways of doing things and offering that to consumers, and if they respond well, then you make a fortune. If they don't, you lose it all. So it's sort of a everything or nothing at all or nothing kind of deal, right? This creates completely new markets by creating new products. That's why I've been talking about how you're expanding the boundaries of the system itself rather than tweaking the system and how it works. Okay? Oh, there it is. That's my book. Okay, so when Schumpeter talked about this, much before I wrote my book, he talked about it in 5 different kinds, and if you want to read anything by Schumpeter, I recommend that you pick up a copy of The Theory of Economic Development and read page 66. You don't have to read the whole thing, just read that page, because that page is beautiful. He talked about 5 different ways that you can create new combinations and completely disrupt the economy. It gives you great insight into how to understand how the economy takes leaps forward by pushing the boundaries out. Okay? So what is the answer then? what is entrepreneurship? Is it the process that leads toward equilibrium, or is it what takes us out of equilibrium? What is the answer? Well, my answer is that it's both, and they're both going on at the same time. Which might seem a little strange because I said that economic analysis is not worthless because we have this equilibrating process. But then I'm also arguing that, hey, we have entrepreneurs that disrupt the whole economy and push us out of equilibrium and completely change the boundaries of the system. So how does that work out? Well, we have entrepreneurs of all these kinds. It's not my job to save economics. But economics also does not need saving because economics is good enough at explaining what is going on. However, we should also include the entrepreneur, and that's the main point, right? So entrepreneurs do all of these things that I talked about. They are alert to arbitrage opportunities. They are correcting errors. They solve problems. They make all these adjustments that Kirchner is talking about, but they also create completely new value where no one saw value before. They don't have to just imitate. They innovate as well. They bear uncertainty of these endeavors. They create new ventures where they create new types of goods and services that maybe no one else believes in at all, but they put everything on the line and they believe it really strongly. And when they are successful, they disrupt the economy overall. Okay, so what is then, we must ask, of course, what is it that successful entrepreneurs do? What we do know is that most entrepreneurs fail most of the time. Well, I think this changes. If we are to understand the economy in terms of entrepreneurship, we have to change our perspective quite a bit. We don't have to change the models, we don't have to change economics, but we have to change how we view the economy. So what is it that makes entrepreneurs successful? Well, the short answer is, had I known, I would have started businesses myself instead of teaching. But I know a few things still about the theory in a way. So what is it they do? Well, they create value for consumers. Whether they are of the equilibrating kind or the disequilibrating kind, they still create value for consumers. Without creating value for consumers, they cannot make a profit, they cannot cover their costs, so they lose everything. Okay, and they also must charge a price for that value that they're creating. Note the difference. It's not the same thing that you can charge a price and that there is value in something. Those are different things. And you choose the cost for your business. Now that might sound a little weird, because usually we think of starting businesses and entrepreneurship exactly the other way around. So one of the main errors that I teach for what entrepreneurs do, but they absolutely should not, is that they start thinking about production. So they start with, I want to produce this thing, this product that I really believe in, fine. So they start calculating how much will it cost to produce this thing. And then they add a margin, which is their profit, and they get the prize. And then they go to the market and say, ta-da, here it is. And then, almost always, consumers go, who cares? So they will not buy it. You should start at the other end, because whether your product is valuable or not is completely in the consumer's eyes. Right? Whether the consumer likes it or not, that should be the alpha and omega of what you do. You should start there. That value that they get from using your product might be up here, which means you might be able to charge a price down here. But the price that you can charge is a function of the value that they're getting. You have to offer them a profit. In other words, the value is not your doing, you're just facilitating it. The price is also not your doing, it's something that the consumer really chooses. What you can choose is only the cost. You can choose to produce something of value that is sold at a price, and you can choose to find a cost structure that offers you a profit. So your job is to find the lowest cost possible for the highest value possible. Most entrepreneurs do this completely backwards. No wonder they fail all the time. They never took my classes. Okay, so what this means is you can really find this in Menger. Already in 1871, he understood this. It's still entrepreneurs don't understand this, which is very strange. But value in something in the economy is simply just whatever consumers consider to be satisfying of their wants. Whatever they like, whatever they enjoy using, whatever they feel good using, is value to them. That's it. That's value. Price is whatever they're willing to give up to get this value. So they see the good, they have an image of what they want to do with the good, they imagine how they can use it. Of course, as an entrepreneur, you try to sell it too, so you provide them with the image. That's the advertising. You provide them with a warm, fuzzy feeling that if you use this product, you will be a better person. Well, that helps them to imagine how valuable this is. And that gives them the price too. They're more willing to pay a high price for something that they think will really, really satisfy them on whatever terms. You can't really measure it. And then, of course, the cost comes last. It's the first in the production process, but it comes last in the analysis. This is all in Menger. It's all in Austrian economics. And what drives the entrepreneurs, of course, is profit. And I put this quote here from Mises because I think it's beautiful in the sense that profit is what drives the market economy. But it's a broader concept than this quote itself makes it seem like. It's not simply that whoever gets the most money wins. It might be nice to have a lot of money, but that's not it. This is not simply about the money profit that entrepreneurs can earn. That's nice. Everybody would like a bag of money just like this. But that's not what makes the world go round. Rather, there are two different kinds of profit, right? The entrepreneur is really in the business of providing a means for consumers to make their world better, their lives better. To do this, they need to figure out how to use resources in the best way possible. They need to figure out which resources are really undervalued. Which resources can I use to produce more satisfaction for consumers? Well, this is all in money prices. So if the price they can charge is up here and the costs necessary are down here, they make a difference. The difference is their money profit, the accounting profit. What do they want the accounting profit for? Well, they turn around and they use that money to buy goods and services to satisfy their own wants. That's why you want profit. It's not about the money. It's about satisfying your own wants. It's running a business is their means to be consumers. Okay, what about the other profit? Well, remember how I said the value is up here and the price is down here? The price is whatever the consumer is willing to give up to get that good that they think will satisfy them. Well, that's the profit for the consumer. That's the psychic profit that they feel because they're willing to give up this money or some other type of payment for this good only because they think the good is more valuable. That's the only reason. They expect a psychic profit. That's why they're in it. That's why they're trading. We all know this. We exchange because we both think that we're better off. The entrepreneur sells because he or she believes that there will be money profit, accounting profit from this action. And that accounting profit, that money can be used to buy goods and services. Consumers buy these goods and services because they think they get more out of it. Their satisfaction is greater than from the money they're giving up, simply because they couldn't get anything better for that money. This is the best way that they could see, at least at that moment, how to satisfy their wants. Okay, so what does this mean then? Well, let's take a look at this, where even Austrians go wrong. So this is Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, second-generation Austrian economist, a student of Menger's. Okay, so he talked about how do we figure out prices. Well, his example is sort of a famous example in the history of economic thought, where he talks about a horse market, where you have a certain number of people show up at the market, they want to sell horses. A certain number of people show up to the market because they want to buy horses. And how do you get to a situation where you have a market price, a price that clears the market? There's no one left behind who wants to buy a horse at the market price, but there are no horses to buy. There's no one willing and able to sell a horse at that price, but no one wants to buy. So everybody gets to buy or sell who wants to at that price. Well, his analysis is a little different than the gang sign, but it's sort of compatible with it still. So what it says is that there's going to be a range within which the market price will end up. And it's set by the marginal pairs. So if you have lots of sellers and they're bidding under each other with a price and lots of buyers bidding over each other, it's going to end up somewhere over the second most capable buyer and under the second most capable seller. Somewhere in between there. Exactly where, we don't know. Okay? Well, what is wrong with this? Well, he's focusing on the physical good. He's talking about horses as the good. Okay, what is wrong with this? Well, maybe nothing, if you're thinking about the economy as the gang sign. But what did we talk about just a minute ago? We talked about the value, the satisfaction. If the good is actually in the eyes of the consumer, then a horse is not a horse, it's not a horse. A horse can be used for many different things. So maybe I like riding, maybe someone needs the horse to transport stuff, someone else just needs a good meal. Still horses, very different ends, very different values, right? Okay, so if this is the case, the consumers can use horses for very different things. This example has very arbitrary limitations, arbitrary boundaries. Why would people show up to a market just for horses and treating horses in exactly the same way? And what does it actually mean to find this market clearing price for a horse, the physical good, when people value different uses of the horse? That doesn't make any sense. Yes, you will have a price in terms of money that clears the market and whatever, but haven't you really mixed apples and oranges here? People value very different things with these horses, and maybe it's the case that a horse is not really at the top of the list. Maybe there are other means of transportation, say a Lamborghini or something like that. Okay? So in order to understand this is really the gang sign analysis, right? We already have the horses, they're produced, they're already offered, and we have people who show up who want the horses for whatever reasons. We don't have any entrepreneurship here. This is an analysis completely without entrepreneurship, so obviously that cannot be valid. So let's add those two perspectives of entrepreneurship to this example. Okay, so if we add entrepreneurship that leads to the market price, leads to the gang sign analysis, what does that mean? Well, that type of entrepreneurship would solve errors made by those buyers and sellers. So if they produce the wrong quantities, then there's going to be shortages or surpluses and so forth, and entrepreneurs are going to figure out how to produce a better quantity and so forth, right? They're going to find more and better information to act on. They're going to avoid inefficiencies that were in the system already. But it's also the case that the horse market itself might have too many horses. Maybe the horses should be used over there in some other market. Maybe there is another horse market that needs to be combined with this one. Maybe in this town, people really, really want horses, whereas people in this other town, where they're also selling horses, they don't actually need a whole lot of horses. Well, that's an arbitrage opportunity, just like Kirstner was talking about, moving from one market to the other, or vice versa. And in order to do that, that is entrepreneurship. You can't just look at that one market somewhere and talk about the market clearing price. You need to combine all those markets in order to make it make the analysis complete. Okay? So, move ahead. Yes. What this means then is really that we're not talking about the physical goods at all. So what is implied in this analysis is that we're really talking about value analysis. We're talking about entrepreneurship as the supply of value. And we talked about that before, so it should be no surprise to you, right? That value is whatever consumers think that they can get out of the product. If it is a horse, many different things. People value many different things with horses. Well, if it is really a value analysis, then shouldn't we compare any type of value? Satisfaction is a satisfaction. Whatever the consumer sees as different ways of satisfying a want, those are the actual substitutes for that consumer. Another consumer might have completely different view, might have completely different want to satisfy completely different want and sees completely different substitutes. So this guy over here might see a horse and a donkey as completely equally serviceable substitutes, whereas this guy over here who wants to eat the horse might see the horse and bread as substitutes. Those are very different. So how can you say that if you assume that they're in a horse market, that you will find a market clearing price for horses, because you have arbitrarily excluded substitutes in the eyes of the consumer? Right? If it is actually in the eyes of the consumer, substitutes are also in the eyes of the consumer, depending on what wants they want to satisfy. So this is very different. We're not talking about the physical good anymore. And this is implied in Persner's analysis, right? So when we talk about value instead, we need to combine all these different products and look at the opportunity costs from the point of view of the consumer, right? Which makes the supply and demand analysis for one good quite arbitrary and artificial. So we can't really look at the economy only using the equilibrating entrepreneurship, because it implies a value perspective, which means we have to start with the consumer also in how to define what a good is and which goods are equally serviceable. Now, Menger does this too, so this is not actually a surprise, but this is not part of economics. Economics proper usually starts with a physical good and looks at that. And we want to understand the prices of physical goods. I'm not saying that it's totally wrong, but in order to understand the economy overall, if we want to add entrepreneurship, we need to look at the value. We need to look at the consumer, how the consumer sees things. Okay, so we can't just look at the within system arbitrage opportunities and the adjustments that go on within the system. Okay, so we need to add this other type of entrepreneurship as well. Okay, so if we're not just refining the system, if we're just reallocating a little bit, but instead we're looking at completely new ways of satisfying wants. What if these entrepreneurs were actually looking at, as they should do, satisfying consumers, and they're not focusing on producing a product? What if they would not produce automobiles, but they were looking to satisfy consumers' want for transportation? Then it could be automobiles, it could be airplanes, it could be bicycles, it could be sneakers, depending on what market segment you have. Those could be substitutes for the transportation want that a car could satisfy, right? Well, then we need to look at new types of goods that entrepreneurs can pursue in order to satisfy these wants. We need to try to imagine what entrepreneurs can offer in this economy and completely disrupt and break this economy open and change the boundaries of it. Because without that, the analysis is definitely not complete. It's sort of arbitrary, or at least a little artificial, right? But that also means that if we're focusing on the value and the wants that consumers want to satisfy, we need to also talk about what type of wants they might discover that they want to satisfy. Because that happens a lot too. When you're consuming a certain good and when you're buying a certain good, you learn not only about your consumption and your experience of using goods, but you also learn about other wants that you have. That next time I'm not going to do this. I'm going to do this other thing instead, and so forth. Okay, so then you have a competition between entrepreneurs that is not simply, I'm producing bread, he's producing bread, so we're both bakers and we're both competing for the same customers. No, because if I'm producing bread and he's producing tires for cars, we're still competing. Because we're competing to satisfy the wants of consumers, which means we're trying to get to the point where they part with their money to satisfy their wants. which means that we might very well be a choice for a consumer, bread or tires. Not just different types of bread. That's an artificial choice between different types of bread. Of course, we choose between different types of bread too, but when we have money, which want will we want to satisfy? That's the question we're asking ourselves. And then that means that whatever entrepreneurs offer the greatest value at the lowest price will get our money, whether or not it is bread or tires for the car. That's a very different way of thinking about the economy, right? But it's core to Austrian economics. That's why Austrian economics is so different from mainstream economics. Okay? So what is it that successful entrepreneurs do? Well, these are two quotes that sort of capture what they do, I think, very well. So the first one is Henry Ford. You might have heard of him. He produced automobiles, right? So apparently he never actually said this, but it's a quote that is very commonly used, and I think it captures perfectly the problem that entrepreneurs face every day. He says, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Because that's what was on people's mind in terms of transportation. They were thinking horses. Because that's how you transported stuff. That's how you transported yourself. There was no other option, so why would they know anything about anything else? So that's how they chose, but he had a different idea. He imagined that people would be able to transport themselves without horses, with just automobiles, which is very common today, of course. But he had this vision that would change people completely and change how they behave by satisfying their want in a completely new way that other entrepreneurs had no clue that he was going for. So, is it true? Well, Steve Jobs from Apple Computers, he had a similar statement where he said that sometimes people just don't know what it is they want until they see it, which is exactly true. That's why entrepreneurs fail so often, even if they include consumers in the process of developing their product. Because until you see the finished product and you're offered a vision for how to use it, you don't actually realize the type of value it can offer you, which makes it really hard to think about the economy in these terms. Because there's something missing from this. Something very big is missing from this, right? Because this is talking about the physical goods that already exist, that people already have an appreciation for. They already have a reservation price and so forth. But if this is the real economy, and that's my claim that this is the real economy, then this is going to be disrupted every day. And we're also trying to solve all those problems and correct the errors that entrepreneurs have made before us. So we're always seeing equilibration and disequilibration at the very same time. Okay, so where does this lead us? Except for wasting an hour of your time. What have I accomplished? Well, there are several things that are pretty important, okay? So entrepreneurs compete with each other whether or not they're equilibrating or disequilibrating. They're always seeking to supply value to consumers, and that is the core of what they're doing. Whether they are solving errors that have already been made in the economy, or they're introducing new errors through innovations, leaving everybody else behind, they're doing the same thing. They're pursuing value for consumers, and that's it, right? If with a value perspective, it's not really about equilibration and disequilibration. It's just about supplying value. And that's it. There's nothing else to it. So whether we refine existing goods, whether we produce an iPhone version 32, or whatever it might be, just incremental change, incremental improvements, or completely new disruptive good, it doesn't matter. Because it's successful if it offers value to consumers. End of story. That's it. Okay? It also means that the market process analysis, which Austrians are engaged with, needs to have two different levels. One that is the diffusion of innovation, the equilibrating sort of Kersnerian within system type of action. And the other level where you're shifting the boundaries through disruption. And they're both happening at the very same time, side by side, which makes the analysis more complex, but also more interesting. Okay? So it means that the supply and demand analysis that we started out with the gang sign is not worthless. That's not what I'm saying. So those of you who are economics professors, don't kill me. It's not worthless, but it is more limited in its application than we might actually think it is. It's only not so limited because we think of the world in terms of physical goods. But that's the wrong way of thinking about it. We should think about it in terms of value. And then it's not all that suited in all these situations. It does help us with surpluses and shortages. It does help us with figuring out the price for a specific good and so forth. But that's a much more limited concern. Okay, that's not as important as we might think, because someone else might disrupt this at any moment. And they're probably already working on it. Okay? So we can use this standard supply and demand analysis for calculating elasticities and all this good stuff that we do in economics courses. That's perfectly fine. I'm not saying that is wrong in any sense, but that also assumes that there is no entrepreneurship, neither equilibrating nor disequilibrating. So we can do that, and do that in terms of firm strategy. Because I'm not saying that the economy is disrupted every hour. It's definitely not. Right? So we have stretches of time where not a whole lot is going on, especially if you are a business in a mature industry, and your job is to capture as much of the profits as possible. So if you're in strategic management of a business, supply and demand analysis is perfectly fine. And you need to position yourself with respect to the other producers of exactly the same good. Why? Because consumers have already learned that that specific good satisfies a want. So until they learn something else, until they learn about a completely different good, they're going to buy this good. And for that period of time, you will need to position yourself with respect to other producers. But always expect to be disrupted, because your industry will go away. It will disappear unless you're protected from innovation by regulations. And if that is the case, you will see vast waste and inefficiencies, and that's a whole different story, right? Okay, so just to reiterate, if you think about the market in terms of value, and every exchange in terms of getting more value out of the world, the economy itself changes drastically, and economics, the study of the economy, changes drastically. It's no longer an economy where we're redistributing things. It's an economy where we're creating things. It's an economy where we're all increasing our standard of living because we're correcting errors and because we're expanding the boundaries, because there is entrepreneurship. But that's a completely different mindset. And then, of course, in that type of world, which is much more similar to the real world than the gang sign economics model, in that type of world, any type of messing with and guiding people in buying something that they would not choose voluntarily to buy is necessarily a loss to them. So it's not only about the companies that are not able to produce something, which is loss of accounting profit, it's also loss of consumer profit, that psychic profit that I mentioned. The value perspective makes it very clear that there is no other system that can beat markets, free markets, and that any limitation or restriction placed on economies means that there will be less value. You cannot satisfy people to the same degree as without those restrictions. So any restriction is a loss of value, both for producers and for consumers. Thank you.
Bem, queria saber se tem alguma pergunta da plateia, Ah, que bom. Eu tenho uma também, mas... Vamos tentar.
Não, é o seguinte, eu queria que o professor Bylund falasse se ele acredita que pode existir empreendedorismo destrutivo e como isso pode afetar a compreensão do que é empreendedorismo, no final das contas.
Can you have destructive entrepreneurship? Is it possible?
Is it possible? Okay, so I have already assigned Fernando to write a paper on whether this is possible or not. So am I going to give you the answer? I think, in a sense, it's a definitional issue. So if you talk about entrepreneurship in value terms, no, you cannot destroy, unless you destroy your own worth. Right? But can you make a profit, an accounting profit, by offering goods that withdraw psychic profit from others? Very likely, right? And especially political entrepreneurship, you can do that. But there's a big discussion, as I know you're aware of, about productive, unproductive, and destructive entrepreneurship. And in that discussion, the framework is the institutional setting for entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship itself is neither, according to this view. It's productive if institutions support productive entrepreneurship. It's destructive if the institutions are themselves destructive and sort of guide entrepreneurship towards destroying value. But this is not necessarily a very good analysis because it's by definition, right? Which is why I asked you to write that paper.
Sim.
Can I make it in English? Professor, first of all, thank you for your talk. I would like to know how do you see the Foss and Klein judgment-based view, and if there's any complementary or it's totally opposed to Kirchnerian and Schumpeter view.
So if there's a contradiction between Foss and Klein and Schumpeter?
Yeah, no,
That's a very good question. I'm not sure. I mean, what they're trying to do in their book, Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgment, is to explain why there are firms. So they're not trying to explain what entrepreneurship is, but they're just assuming that it is. And they're not actually saying that entrepreneurship is either equilibrating or disequilibrating. So they're sort of being agnostic to that. I think, though, if I may put words in their mouths, that they might be opposed to the Schumpeterian view of entrepreneurship as just disruptive, and especially how Schumpeter conceives of the entrepreneur as coming from nowhere. Right? So to Schumpeter, the entrepreneur is acting sort of from outside the system and just introduces a new innovation that disrupts the economy completely, and no one saw it coming. So everybody just has to adapt to this new innovation. And I know they are opposed to that, but I think that is also a very strong interpretation of Schumpeter, and it's unfair to that view, not necessarily to Schumpeter, because he does say that. But I think the whole disruptive view of entrepreneurship can very well be created from within. I mean, there are definitely problems with Schumpeter's view. For instance, he does not treat entrepreneurs as alike. Right? So one problem with his view is that he has all these entrepreneurs in the economy, but there's only this one that can disrupt it. And that one disrupts the economy, and then everybody goes, oh my God, what happened? And they all try to imitate what this guy did. But a proper analysis would, of course, realize that there's this one who's trying to disrupt the economy, but there's this other guy who's also trying to disrupt the economy, and a third. So if they're all trying to do this, or many of them are trying to do this at the same time, the analysis is different. Right? So you do not have one disruption and then the economy catches up. but instead you have disruptions a little all over the place and in different markets at the same time. But I think, the short answer is simply that Foss and Klein are not trying to explain entrepreneurship. They're trying to explain why there are firms.
Professora Roberta, por favor.
Você traduz para ele?
Não, você pode já falar diretamente se quiser. Fala tão bonito inglês.
Pierre, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm just wondering, it's the first time I hear this perspective of yours on value, and I'm wondering if we economists, we hesitate to incorporate the value perspective because we were grown up with the idea of Milton Friedman that we should avoid normative claims, talk about values, and we try so bad to get rid of this, and at the end of the day, we are all worse off. How to convince economists to incorporate the value perspective?
Could you say that last part again?
How to convince economists of the value perspective, how to get rid of the methodology of positive economics.
Next to Daniel.
Yeah. How much time do we have? That's a very good question, because what I presented was really my interpretation of Austrian economics. So it was really nothing new. It's just it's explained in a new way. I think this is how Menger conceived of the economy and the market process, and this is how Mises does too. So thinking of it in these terms and reading Human Action again makes it stand out as a very different book. And in a sense, Austrian economics lost the battle a long time ago, and it's not really considered a school of economics. But if I may speculate a little bit, I think economics is, it has already lost its soul, in a sense, because it's not really explaining the economy anymore. And to put it very briefly, I think what economists are doing is they're assuming equilibrium, which means they need to explain why we're not there. Right? That's what Kerzner was trying to do in '73 in his book. But economists are still struggling with this, which is why economists are moving into psychology. Right? So they're saying all the models are saying that the economy should be in general equilibrium, but we're not. What the heck happened? Right? Well, then you have to move back and you go, oh, well, something is wrong with people's minds. Right? They have biases and they're just stupid and whatever it might be. Right? So then you have behavioral economics and all these things going back and looking into people's skulls. Whereas Austrians go the other way. Right? So they say, well, whatever is going on in people's minds, we can't know about it, and it doesn't really matter. Because what matters is how they act, because that's going to have consequences in the economy overall, and that's what we care about as economists. We want to know why there are shortages, why there are surpluses. We want to know where goods come from. We want to know where wealth and prosperity and higher standards of living come from, and that's what we want to explain. But that's sort of excluded in the economic analysis when you start by assuming general equilibrium, right? So I think economics has become sort of a math version of psychology. So they're poor mathematicians, poor statisticians trying to do psychology. So I think very soon we might actually see a new type of discipline emerge, where economists go further and further into studying psychology, and that creates a gap for explaining the actual economy, the market process. And that's where I think Austrians need to be and put a big stake in the ground and say, hey, we're here, we have these explanations. So I think there's definitely a chance for a renaissance for Austrian economics in that sense, because we have a lot that we can explain that economists cannot. But economics, in a sense, has to fail first, which is, it's not an optimistic story, right? Sort of pessimistic, but I think economists are digging their own grave in this.
Alguma outra pergunta? Uma bio? Vamos lá. Os professores se animaram.
Hi, Per. Congrats for your speech. It makes clear for me many things of the economy theory. But my question is out of the economy. I'm trying to understand where the disruption is born. Why big corporations don't bring the disruptive innovation, and they come from mainly from startups?
Okay, I'm not sure I have an answer to that. I would go back to Schumpeter, to page 66, where he says that innovations usually happen in small startups. And why? It's simply because whoever has a new idea does not fit in an existing organization. Because big corporations are organized around one type of production very often. So they are also managed to do that really well. So one way to think about it is entrepreneurs create these new goods, they facilitate this new value for consumers, but as soon as they have created the business and established it, made sure that production works, they hire managers to cut the cost and refine the production process internally to the firm, right? So it's not a whole lot of innovation anymore, other than refining the process and maybe creating new generations, sort of incremental improvements to the product and positioning of the business with respect to other businesses. So they sort of lose sight of the consumer because they've already recognized that or observed that there is some want here that we can satisfy through this type of good, and they focus on that specific good. Others have these novel ideas for how to satisfy wants in very different ways or satisfy very different wants, and they will have to start anew. I mean, they can seek funding from large corporations and so forth, but this type of open-mindedness, this type of creative, imaginary type of thinking usually does not have a place in sort of bureaucratic organizations. And huge corporations are very much like the state in how they're run. So you have routines, you have policy documents, everybody has their place, you have a hierarchy and so forth. So there's really no space for thinking about new things. And there are some examples of exceptions to this, like Xerox Labs, for instance. I think Microsoft Research is a good example too, where a corporation takes part of the profits and puts in a separate organization or a separate division where they just tell their employees that go there and just play with stuff. There's plenty of funding. Just play with it and see what you can come up with, and then maybe it will turn it to a type of good or a device that we can sell. But it's not necessarily clear that this will actually lead to new goods very often. And I think Xerox Labs is a good example of that, where they invented the mouse, they invented the graphical user interface for computers and everything like that, but they never did anything with it, right? So Steve Jobs used the graphical interface in his first Apple computer, and he used the mouse as well. Where did he get those ideas? Well, he got a tour of Xerox Labs, and they showed it to him, and he was like, this is revolutionary, because he realized that this could satisfy people's wants in a very different way, could facilitate a completely different type of computer. But in that corporation, they had just laughed at the mouse thing. And you call it a mouse? There's one quote from this, right? They were laughing at the engineers because what can you do with that sort of thing? And you even call it a mouse. Why would anybody want a mouse on their desk? Right?
Thank you.
Bem, dado o avançado da hora, vamos por um encerramento. Wish to thank you for this great and provocative speech. Em nome da Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, do Centro Mackenzie de Liberdade Econômica, queremos dizer ao professor obrigado por essa grande e provocativa palestra que ele acabou de proferir. E aproveito então para dar por encerrado o terceiro Fórum Mackenzie de Liberdade Econômica. Gostaria de agradecer a todos os palestrantes e a todos os professores e a todo o público presente. E nos veremos no quarto Fórum Mackenzie de Liberdade Econômica ano que vem. Muito obrigado.